Lily curled up tightly on the cold metal bench, her tiny body shivering under the thin blanket she had found discarded near the trash cans a few nights ago. She had been living here, in this forgotten corner of the city park, for what felt like forever. The mornings brought harsh sunlight and the chirping of birds, but also a deep, gnawing hunger in her stomach. Her young eyes, wide and alert, scanned the surroundings, looking for any hint of food or a place to hide if someone came too close. That morning, however, something caught her eye. Underneath the bench, barely visible in the dim morning light, was a black suitcase. Its surface was scratched and scuffed, but it was unmistakably locked, as if holding something precious inside. Lily looked around, expecting someone to swoop in and grab it, but no one came. Heart pounding, she reached out and dragged the suitcase closer, her small fingers trembling as she undid the latches. With a slight creak, the suitcase popped open, and there, inside, lay stacks of bills, neatly bound together, filling the suitcase to the brim. Her breath caught in her throat. She had never seen so much money in her life. She couldn't even imagine what that much money could buy. Food, clothes, even a warm bed. For a moment, the thought of using the money to escape her life on the streets flashed through her mind. Just take a little, she whispered to herself, her fingers reaching out toward the stack. Just enough for some bread, maybe a warm jacket. But as her fingers grazed the money, a strange feeling of guilt bubbled up inside her. The money wasn't hers, and whoever it belonged to would probably be as desperate to find it as she was to keep it. Her hand froze, hovering above the stack. Lily thought of her mother, her gentle voice, and the way she had taught her right from wrong before she disappeared. She let out a shaky breath, her fingers slowly retreating from the tempting bills. The money weighed heavily in Lily's thoughts as she roamed the city streets, clutching the suitcase tightly against her chest. She had no idea where to go or how to even begin finding its owner. As the morning crowd filled the sidewalks, she felt small and out of place, like an ant trying to navigate a sea of feet and legs. Her feet took her instinctively toward the police station she had passed many times but never dared to approach. She watched people coming and going, police cars pulling in, and officers with stern faces walking briskly in and out. Her heart pounded as she stood at the edge of the busy street, clutching the suitcase and feeling the weight of her decision settle in. "Do I really want to do this?" she whispered to herself, doubting for the 100th time. Just then, a police officer, noticing her standing there, crossed the street toward her. He was young, with a kind face that softened as he approached. He bent down slightly to her level, his gaze shifting to the suitcase in her arms. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently. "What brings you here?" Lily felt her throat tighten, and her mind raced as she tried to gather her words. I found this," she stammered, holding up the suitcase. The officer's eyes widened in surprise, and he gestured toward a nearby bench. "Let's sit down and talk about it, okay?" They walked to the bench, and Lily sat down, her little hands still gripping the suitcase protectively. "Do you know what's inside?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Yes," she replied softly, casting her eyes down. "It's full of money." The officer gave a small, surprised smile and nodded. "And you brought it here? That's very brave of you, Lily. Very brave." Lily glanced up at him, her wide eyes showing a hint of the uncertainty and fear she felt. I thought it would be the right thing. Someone must be looking for it. Someone must need it back." He smiled reassuringly, nodding as he reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing, Lily. I'll make sure we get this back to its owner. And you know, it's very kind of you to think about someone else when you found this. That's not something everyone would do." Lily felt a warmth spread inside her, something close to pride, even if it was mingled with the hunger still gnawing at her. She watched the officer as he lifted the suitcase with ease, securing it as they walked together toward the station. Inside the police station, Lily felt overwhelmed by the bustling environment. The voices on radios, officers chatting as they came and went, the constant ringing of phones. Everything seemed larger, louder, and busier than any place she'd ever been. Her eyes roamed over the room, unsure of where to look or what to expect. The officer guided her to a quieter room, where he asked her to sit down again. Now, we'll need to check if anyone has reported a missing suitcase like this, he explained. In the meantime, let's see if we can find someone who might know where it came from. After a few moments of searching on his computer, the officer's face brightened. Well, it looks like we have a match. This suitcase belongs to someone named Charles Blake. Do you know him? Lily shook her head slowly, the name unfamiliar to her. Well, Mr. Blake is a pretty important businessman in town. I'm sure he'll be glad to hear his suitcase has been found. He glanced at her again, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, we could arrange for you to return it to him yourself, if you'd like. He might want to meet the young lady who was honest enough to bring it back. Lily hesitated, unsure if she wanted to face the man who had lost so much money. But something inside her, a tiny spark of courage, pushed her to nod. All right then, let's go meet Mr. Charles Blake, the officer said, leading her back toward the entrance. The police car ride was both thrilling and nerve-wracking for Lily, who had never ridden in one before. She clutched her hands tightly, her mind racing with questions about what this Charles Blake might be like. Would he be angry? Would he think she had tried to take the money? The car pulled up to a towering building in the business district, and Lily stared up at the glassy skyscraper that seemed to touch the clouds. The officer led her into the building, where they were directed to a high floor. Lily swallowed hard, clutching her hands tightly as they took the elevator up, her heart thudding as each floor passed by with a soft ding. Finally, the doors opened, and she found herself in a spacious, pristine office. Everything around her felt expensive and polished, from the polished floors to the large paintings on the walls. Behind a huge desk sat a man with graying hair and an air of authority. He looked up from his papers as they entered, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the small figure standing by the officer's side. Mr. Blake, the officer said with a respectful nod, this young lady, Lily, has something to return to you. Charles Blake's eyes softened as he looked at her, his gaze moving from her ragged clothes to the timid expression on her face. Lily took a shaky breath and held out the suitcase, her small hands trembling as she extended it toward him. I found this, she whispered. It's yours. For a long moment, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the suitcase. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it from her hands. You found this? And you brought it back to me? He asked, his voice full of surprise. Lily nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. I thought you might need it back. I know what it's like to lose something important. A faint smile touched his lips, and he placed the suitcase gently on the desk. Looking back at her, he tilted his head slightly, a flicker of something warm and genuine in his eyes. Thank you, Lily. Not many people would have done what you did. Before she could respond, he leaned forward, his eyes studying her with a curious kindness. Tell me, is there anything I can do for you? Anything you need? Lily looked down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. She wasn't used to people offering her anything, let alone asking what she wanted. For a moment, her mind went blank, and then, fighting the hesitation, she lifted her eyes to Charles Blake, who was still watching her with that same curious expression. There is something, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. It's not for me, though. Charles leaned forward, intrigued. Go on, he urged gently, his tone encouraging. Lily took a breath, feeling the weight of her words before they even left her mouth. I want you to help me find my mom. The request hung in the air, startling the officer and Charles both. But Lily was too focused on the memory of her mother to notice. She could picture her mother's face, hear her warm laughter, and remember the way her mother used to call her little bird whenever they shared secrets or moments of joy together. Lily's voice cracked slightly as she continued, but she kept going. My mom went away a long time ago, she said, her small fingers gripping the sides of her chair. She didn't come back, and I don't know why. I've been waiting, hoping she'd come back for me. A shadow crossed Charles's face, and he exchanged a glance with the officer, who looked equally at a loss for words. You've been alone all this time? Charles asked, his voice softer now, as if speaking too loudly would shatter her fragile memories. Lily nodded, swallowing back the lump in her throat. I just want to know if she's okay. Maybe she's out there and doesn't know where I am. A heavy silence filled the room as Charles took in her words, the weight of her loneliness sinking into him. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel when he saw the suitcase in her small hands that morning. A deep pull to help this girl. He looked at her thin frame, her eyes far older than they should be, and the desperation barely hidden in her expression. Charles leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "Lily," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I'm not a detective, but I do know people who could help us look for her. I can make some calls, ask around, but I'll need to know everything you can remember about her and about what happened. Can you do that?" Lily's heart pounded, her eyes filling with a mix of hope and fear. She had dreamed of this moment, someone helping her, someone caring enough to look for her mother. But she also knew there were things she didn't understand about why her mother had left, things that made her afraid to know the truth. "Yes," she replied, nodding earnestly. "I remember a lot." Charles gave her an encouraging smile, then glanced at the officer, who nodded and stepped forward, taking notes as Lily described everything she remembered about her mother. Her mother's name, Emma Green, her gentle voice, her caring nature, the laughter that filled their tiny apartment before everything changed. Charles listened intently, his fingers steepled as he took in each word. As Lily talked, memories of his own past crept into his thoughts. Moments he'd spent neglecting family and friends in favor of his career, his reputation, his wealth. He pushed those memories aside for now, focusing on her words. "I remember," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She used to work at some big building downtown. She wore nice clothes and had a yellow scarf she loved. She always smelled like lavender." She trailed off, struggling to pull together fragments of memories. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Do you remember anything about where she worked? Did she ever talk about it?" Lily scrunched her face in concentration. "She used to say it was something about building things to help people. I don't know what it means, but she said they were trying to make things better for people who didn't have much." A strange expression crossed Charles's face. That description sounded all too familiar. Years ago, he had funded several projects that aimed to help low-income families, providing affordable housing and resources. He had thought of it as a public relations boost, something to make his company look good, but he hadn't been closely involved in the day-to-day management. "Lily," he said slowly, the pieces clicking into place, "I might actually know something about where your mother worked." He could hardly believe the coincidence. "Let me look into this, all right? I'll see what I can find out." Lily's face brightened with a faint spark of hope, her eyes wide. "Really? You think you can find something about her?" Charles nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over him. "I'll do my best. I promise." He extended his hand to her, and after a hesitant pause, Lily reached out and took it. The handshake felt like a quiet pact, one neither of them fully understood yet. Charles didn't know what lay ahead or if he would even be able to find Emma, but he knew that he was now committed to helping this little girl in any way he could. After escorting her back downstairs, Charles knelt beside her and held her gaze. "Now, Lily, you have somewhere to stay tonight?" She hesitated, then shook her head. I don't really." He looked over at the officer, who nodded. "We can arrange something safe for her while we get this search started," he assured Charles. But Charles found himself hesitating. Something tugged at him. A sense of responsibility, perhaps, or the silent plea in Lily's eyes. "Lily," he said quietly, "if it's all right with you, I can arrange for a place nearby, just until we get some answers." Lily looked at him, a glimmer of relief softening her expression. She nodded, grateful and tired. Charles gave her a small, encouraging smile. "Then that's settled. I'll make sure you're safe tonight, and tomorrow, we'll start looking for your mother." The next morning, Charles leaned back in his office chair, staring at the photo he'd found on his computer. Emma Green. Her personnel file from one of his company's earlier social projects included a photo of a smiling young woman with warm eyes and a yellow scarf around her neck, the very image Lily had described. He felt a pang in his chest, realizing that Emma was not just a random name in his files, but someone who'd once had a life, a family, and a purpose. Her expression in the photo was kind, almost maternal. Charles thought of Lily's innocent request to find her mother, and the memory of her pleading eyes pushed him to keep digging. The project Emma had worked on was familiar to him. Years back, he'd launched an ambitious plan to revitalize low-income housing areas, a program touted as revolutionary and charitable, with promises to lift families out of poverty. But things had become complicated. He had left the details to his managers, people he'd trusted to carry out the project, focusing instead on the media attention and the goodwill it brought to his name and his business. The program had faced several controversies before it was shut down, and he had all but washed his hands of it. Now, however, Charles was beginning to wonder if Emma's disappearance might be tied to what had happened back then. His heart raced as he sifted through archived reports, contracts, and complaints filed against the project managers, tracing a faint, disturbing thread that hinted at shady practices and budget mismanagement by those he had put in charge. But there was more, a series of emails from Emma. She'd filed concerns about the project's operations, questioning the ethics and intentions behind certain decisions. Her last email was polite yet firm, pointing out irregularities and requesting an audit. Charles clenched his fists, feeling a wave of guilt and unease. She'd been brave, and her courage had gone unnoticed, buried under stacks of corporate emails and documents that no one had bothered to read. No one except him, now. Just then, the door to his office opened, and Lily stepped inside, led by the officer from the day before. She looked more hopeful today, her eyes expectant as she gazed up at Charles. "Mr. Blake, did you find anything?" she asked, her voice full of quiet anticipation. Charles swallowed, wondering how to tell her what he'd found, or if he even should. "I think I might have," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your mom, she worked on a project that my company sponsored. I didn't know her personally, but from what I've seen, she was very dedicated. She cared about the people she was helping." Lily's face softened with a wistful look, and Charles knew she was picturing her mother as he described her. But, he continued carefully, it seems like there were some problems with the project. She'd raised some concerns about what was going on, and that might have put her in a difficult position. He didn't elaborate further, but he saw the questions form in Lily's eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, sounding older than her 8 years. "Why would she be in a difficult position?" Charles hesitated. He didn't want to frighten her, but he knew he couldn't avoid the truth forever. Sometimes, when people try to do the right thing, it doesn't make everyone happy. Some people want to keep things quiet, or make sure no one asks too many questions. He forced a smile. "But don't worry, Lily. I'm going to do everything I can to find out what happened." She looked down, her fingers clutching the edge of his desk. "So, you think she might still be out there?" Charles nodded, hoping he was telling the truth. "Yes, I do." The officer, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Mr. Blake, I can look into any missing persons cases that match Emma's profile. If there's anything recent or if she was reported missing back then, it might lead us somewhere." "Good idea," Charles replied, nodding. "And I'd like to reopen the project files. Anything we find that doesn't make sense, I want to know about it." Lily watched them both with wide, intent eyes, as if afraid to miss a single word. The officer stood and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Lily, we'll look into all this. It might take a little time, but we won't stop until we have some answers." Lily nodded, her gaze turning back to Charles. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Charles felt a deep ache at her gratitude, realizing just how much she'd been through alone. "You're very brave, Lily," he said gently. "We'll get to the bottom of this." After Lily and the officer left, Charles sat in his empty office, his mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Emma's face in that photo, and he couldn't deny the responsibility he felt. Charles Blake spent the next few days immersed in a flood of paperwork and endless calls, each one taking him closer to answers he both sought and dreaded. His office, usually orderly and pristine, was now strewn with old files, records, and notes he'd hastily scribbled while piecing together a murky picture of what had happened with the housing project Emma Green had been involved in. The project's name, Emerald Heights Community Renewal, had once shown as a beacon of hope for families in need. The goal had been ambitious, to build affordable housing in an underserved neighborhood, complete with community centers, job programs, and a green space for families. It had attracted media attention, charitable donations, and political support. But now, as he sifted through its remnants, Charles saw that things hadn't been as promising as they'd seemed. One afternoon, as he sat at his desk, he found an old email from Emma that chilled him. Dated just 2 months before she disappeared, it was addressed to someone high up in his company, a senior manager who had since left under suspicious circumstances. Emma had written about disturbing discoveries. Funds intended for housing materials had been misappropriated, corner-cutting practices had created unsafe structures, and the promised community centers had never been built. The email ended with a plea to take action before things got worse. Charles's stomach twisted with guilt. She'd been sounding an alarm, and no one had been listening. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Lily quietly entering his office. She waited by the door, watching him with those serious, inquisitive eyes. "Mr. Blake?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Charles looked up, startled. He offered her a small, tired smile. "Lily, I didn't see you come in." She stepped closer, glancing at the mess on his desk. Did you find anything about my mom?" He nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Yes, Lily. I've been going through everything I can find. Your mom, she was very brave. She cared about what was right, even when it meant speaking up against some very powerful people." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm beginning to think her disappearance wasn't an accident. She was trying to stop something that shouldn't have been happening." Lily's expression changed, a mix of confusion and worry shadowing her face. "You mean, someone hurt her?" Charles sighed, not wanting to burden her with fears he wasn't even certain of himself. "I don't know yet, but it seems that way. I've been talking to people who might know something, trying to find someone who saw her or knew her well. It's slow, but we're making progress." She looked down at her shoes, her shoulders slumping. I don't understand why anyone would want to hurt her. She was good. She just wanted to help people." Charles nodded, sharing her frustration. "Sometimes, Lily, people with power don't like it when others try to show them they're wrong. Your mom was strong, and she believed in doing the right thing. But some people, they'd rather stay in control than admit their mistakes." Lily frowned, her young mind struggling to wrap around the darker side of the world. Charles's heart went out to her. He wanted to shelter her, to protect her from these hard truths, but he knew she was already braver and wiser than most adults he knew. She deserved honesty. "I promise we won't stop looking," he said, gently touching her shoulder. "Whatever it takes, we'll find out what happened to your mom." Over the next few days, Charles uncovered more about the project's management team. The more he learned, the more his shame grew. He had signed off on budgets, rubber-stamped reports, and nodded along in meetings, never realizing the depths of the corruption happening right under his nose. Names began to emerge. Executives he'd trusted, project managers he'd praised, each one tangled in layers of deceit. But one name in particular stood out: George Harlow. A former senior executive on the project, George had been Charles's go-to for managing the development. Charles remembered him as charismatic, well-dressed, and confident, a man who knew how to get things done. But beneath that polished exterior, it seemed George had been siphoning funds and paying off inspectors to overlook code violations. And according to Emma's emails, he was the one she had contacted repeatedly, urging him to fix the dangerous issues. Charles's hands shook as he reread those emails. He hadn't spoken to George in years. After the project had been quietly dissolved, George had left the company, and they'd lost touch. But now Charles had a lead. He reached for his phone, his jaw set in determination. That evening, Charles met George in a dimly lit bar, far from the public eye. George seemed surprised by the call, but he'd agreed, perhaps curious or nervous about what Charles might know. "Charles," George greeted him, smiling as though they were still old friends, as if nothing were amiss. He extended a hand, which Charles reluctantly shook. They sat in a secluded booth, and Charles wasted no time in getting to the point. "George, I need to know what really happened with Emerald Heights." George's face stiffened, his smile fading. "That was a long time ago," he said, his voice cautious. "Why bring it up now?" "Because there are things I didn't know back then," Charles replied coldly. "I know about the missing funds, the unsafe buildings. I know that Emma Green tried to warn you, and she disappeared shortly after. I want to know what you know about her. George glanced around nervously, then leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. Emma was persistent, he admitted. She saw things she shouldn't have and was trying to raise hell about it. I told her to back off, but she wouldn't listen. She said people's lives were at stake. Charles felt a surge of anger. And that's when she disappeared? George looked down at his drink, his fingers tapping nervously against the glass. Look, I didn't do anything to her. I swear. But she made powerful people nervous. People who didn't like the idea of someone poking around. So yes, she was warned. She was told to drop it and leave. That's all I know. Charles's fists clenched under the table. Warned by whom? George? Who else was involved? George hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet Charles's. I can't say more, Charles. I'm already taking a risk talking to you. These aren't the kind of people you go up against. They'll ruin you, just like they ruined her. Charles's anger simmered, but he fought to keep his voice calm. If you know something and you don't tell me, then you're just as guilty. I need answers, George. For her daughter. At this, George looked away, uncomfortable. Her daughter. He seemed genuinely surprised. Yes, her daughter. An 8-year-old girl who's been alone on the streets, waiting for her mother to come back. George's face paled, and he shook his head. I didn't know. I didn't think she had family left. She never mentioned a daughter. She does. And that little girl deserves the truth, Charles said, his voice like steel. So, if you know anything that could help us find her, you owe it to Emma, and to that girl, to tell me. George swallowed, his shoulders slumping as if under the weight of his guilt. After a long pause, he finally spoke. There was someone higher up, someone above even us. A man named Malcolm Trent. He kept his hands clean but pulled the strings behind the scenes. He has connections everywhere. Politicians, police, even the courts. He wanted the project to fail in a certain way so he could profit from the land. Charles's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. And Emma? She tried to expose him? Yes, George whispered. She did. She tried. But they didn't give her the chance. I don't know exactly what happened to her, Charles, but Malcolm's people made sure she disappeared. A cold dread filled Charles's stomach. Malcolm Trent was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the city, with a reputation for ruthless business tactics. And if he had played a part in Emma's disappearance, Charles knew they were up against an almost insurmountable enemy. He stared hard at George, his voice barely more than a growl. If anything happens to Lily because of this, George, I'll make sure you and everyone involved pays. George flinched, clearly shaken. I told you everything I know, Charles. Be careful. If you keep digging, they'll come after you too. But Charles was done being afraid. He had let people like Malcolm Trent control his life for too long. For Emma, and for Lily, he would go up against anyone. Leaving the bar, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. He'd been complicit in these people's schemes for years, blinded by his own ambition. But not anymore. Emma's bravery had cost her everything, and if he had to, he'd risk it all to make sure her daughter never had to wonder what happened to her mother again. That night, Charles sat in his office, preparing a plan. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't stop until he found Emma, dead or alive, and held those responsible accountable. Charles spent a sleepless night pacing his office, replaying every word of his conversation with George. Malcolm Trent, the name echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Trent was no ordinary businessman. He was a mogul with deep connections and a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of the cost. Charles knew he was now entering dangerous territory, but the image of Lily's hopeful eyes haunted him. He couldn't back down. He wouldn't. As dawn broke, Charles prepared himself. He didn't know how powerful Malcolm Trent's reach was, but he knew one thing. If he moved too quickly or clumsily, Trent's network would close ranks, and Emma's story, and Lily's only chance at justice, would be buried for good. Charles couldn't let that happen. The first call he made that morning was to a private investigator he knew, an old friend named Jack Preston. Jack was a grizzled man in his 60s with sharp instincts and an unwavering dedication to the truth. They'd worked together on corporate security cases before, but this was different. Charles, Jack's rough voice crackled through the line. "This is a little outside our usual business. Are you sure you want to go down this path?" Charles leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment as he replied, "Jack, this isn't business. This is personal. I need someone who can dig around without attracting too much attention." Jack let out a sigh, his tone softening slightly. "For you, I'll do it. Just know that people like Trent, they don't play fair. If we poke the wrong bear, it could get messy." Charles's jaw tightened. "I understand, Jack, but there's an 8-year-old girl counting on us. I won't let this go." Jack agreed, and by mid-morning, he was already pulling strings, combing through records, old news clippings, and the project's financials. Meanwhile, Charles made a second call to an attorney he trusted, someone he knew wouldn't be swayed by the influence of Trent or his cronies. Over the next few days, Jack reported back with scraps of information, bits of a puzzle that hinted at a larger conspiracy. Malcolm Trent's company had indeed acquired the land where Emerald Heights was supposed to be developed, shortly after the project's abrupt failure. He had purchased it through a shell corporation, allowing him to quietly seize ownership without drawing attention. Trent had then sold the land off in sections, profiting millions from property that should have belonged to the community. "What about Emma?" Charles asked during one of their calls, his voice tight with urgency. "Does any of this explain what happened to her?" Jack hesitated. "It's murky. Emma was a threat, and I'm guessing that people on Trent's payroll made sure she knew it. Her name appears in some internal documents, flagged as a problem. I found mentions of a series of warnings that were issued to her, encouraging her to keep quiet, but she was relentless. She kept pushing." Charles felt a chill. "And when the warnings didn't work?" "She vanished," Jack replied, his tone grave. "All I can tell is that her last known location was near the Emerald Heights site. After that, nothing." Charles gripped the phone tightly. "We have to find someone who knows what happened on that last day." Jack was silent for a moment. "There might be one person. A former site manager named Luis Ortega. He oversaw the construction, and he left the city shortly after Emma disappeared. My sources tell me he's kept a low profile ever since, but I tracked him down. He lives out in a small town a couple of hours away. He might know something, but he may not be willing to talk." "I'll go," Charles said without hesitation. "Just give me the address." The drive out to meet Luis Ortega was long and tense. Charles's mind raced with possibilities, replaying conversations and looking for missed clues. He arrived late in the afternoon, pulling up to a modest home on the edge of a small, quiet town. The place looked worn, with peeling paint and an overgrown garden. Charles wondered if Luis's departure from the city had been voluntary or if he had been forced out as part of a cover-up. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a wary expression opened it. "Luis Ortega?" Charles asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Luis looked him over, his gaze cautious. "Who's asking?" "I'm Charles Blake. I was in charge of the Emerald Heights project. I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to know what happened to Emma Green. She was my employee, and her daughter is still looking for her." Luis's face tensed at the mention of Emma's name. He shifted his weight, glancing over Charles's shoulder to make sure no one was around, then finally gestured for him to come inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit, filled with the smell of coffee and the faint mustiness of old wood. Luis motioned for Charles to sit at a small kitchen table, where he poured 2 mugs of coffee before taking a seat across from him. "You have no idea what you're stirring up, Mr. Blake," Luis began, his voice rough. "Emma was a good woman. She cared about those people in Emerald Heights, more than anyone else in that whole operation." Charles nodded, his gaze steady. "I know. That's why I'm here. She tried to raise the alarm about the problems, about the money being siphoned off. But no one listened." Luis sighed, looking down at his hands wrapped around the coffee mug. "I listened," he said quietly. "She came to me more than once. Told me things weren't right, that corners were being cut. She even asked if I would join her in exposing what was going on. But I was too afraid. I had a family to think about, and Trent's people, they don't mess around." Charles leaned forward, his eyes intense. "What happened to her, Luis? I need to know." Luis looked away, his face drawn. "Emma didn't back down. She kept digging, even after Trent's men told her to stop. One night, she called me, said she'd found something big, proof, maybe. She sounded scared but determined. Told me she was heading to the construction site to meet someone who had information. Charles's heart pounded. And then, Louise took a shaky breath. That was the last time anyone heard from her. I went to the site the next day, but there was no sign of her. Trent's men were already there, making sure no one asked questions. They told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd be next. Charles felt a wave of anger. You could have come forward. You could have told someone. Louise shook his head. And what would that have done? They would have buried me, just like they buried her. People like Trent have friends in high places, and Emma underestimated just how far they'd go to protect themselves. The weight of the revelation settled over Charles like a heavy blanket. He thought of Lily, waiting and hoping for news of her mother, and the realization of what Emma had gone through in her final hours filled him with a deep, burning guilt. Do you remember what proof she said she had? Charles asked, desperate for any remaining piece of Emma's story. Louise nodded slowly. She mentioned financial records, proof of bribes, payments made to inspectors to look the other way. She said she had copies, enough to blow the whole thing open. Do you know where she kept them? Louise hesitated, then gave a slight nod. She had a storage locker in the city. I don't know if it's still there or if Trent's people found it, but it's the only place she would have hidden something important. Charles rose from his chair, extending a hand to Louise. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Louise shook his hand, but kept his expression solemn. Be careful, Mr. Blake. Trent won't like it if you start digging around. He has people everywhere. Charles nodded, understanding the gravity of the warning. But he'd come too far to turn back now. Back in the city, Charles tracked down the storage facility using the address Louise had given him. It was a nondescript building on the edge of town, its rows of identical doors stretching out in neat lines under the dim, buzzing lights of the parking lot. He signed in with the clerk, explaining that he was there on behalf of Emma Green's family, and within minutes, he was led to a small, unassuming storage unit. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he unlocked the door. Inside, under a thin layer of dust, were several boxes labeled with Emma's handwriting. Carefully, he opened the nearest one and began sifting through its contents, files, receipts, and stacks of meticulously organized documents. Then, finally, he found it, a thick folder with copies of financial records and lists of payments, each one linked to Trent shell companies and the false inspections. Charles stared at the folder, feeling both exhilarated and horrified. Emma had gathered it all, risking everything to do what he had ignored. She'd been silenced, but now, thanks to her courage, he held the power to bring the truth to light. Charles sat in his office, staring at the folder in his hands, his heart pounding with a sense of urgency and trepidation. The weight of Emma's documents felt almost physical, as if the years of secrets she'd collected had condensed into a single, fragile packet. He flipped through the papers slowly, his eyes scanning the names, figures, and signatures that painted a clear picture of corruption. The documents detailed payments to city officials, inspectors, and subcontractors, all orchestrated to drain the project's budget while cutting corners that put the community at risk. And there, in the mix, were notations clearly linking the transactions back to Malcolm Trent's various shell companies. Charles could hardly believe the extent of the deceit. Emma had gathered this information alone, knowing full well the risks, and yet she hadn't wavered. She had documented each bribe, each illicit deal, each falsified inspection report. Her notes were detailed and scathing, pointing to everything Charles had once turned a blind eye to, trusting that the people he'd hired were handling things ethically. He let out a slow, trembling breath. The time for self-pity was over. It was time for action. He needed to decide what to do with these documents and how to use them to bring Trent's network to justice without risking Lily's safety or his own. As if on cue, the phone on his desk buzzed. Startled, he grabbed it, half expecting Trent's people to somehow know he was holding this damning evidence. But it was Jack. Jack's voice was steady, but there was a tension in his tone. I've got news. It's not good. Charles's grip tightened on the phone. What is it? There's chatter that someone's been sniffing around the Emerald Heights project. Trent's people know. They don't have specifics yet, but word is they're getting close. If they figure out it's you, they'll come down hard. You and I both know Trent won't let this go easily. Charles nodded, feeling a chill settle over him. I understand. I found the documents Emma hid. They confirm everything, Jack. Everything Trent did. The bribes, the lies. It's all here. Jack was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his tone was heavy. Then you're sitting on a powder keg, my friend. You need to act fast. I know, Charles replied, his mind racing. But this isn't just about me. If Trent's people get wind of this, they'll try to bury everything again, and they might come after Lily. I can't let that happen. Jack's voice softened. I get it, Charles. This girl deserves justice, and so does her mother. If you're willing, I can help connect you with someone who has the power to make this public. But it'll need to be airtight. Once it's out there, there's no turning back. Charles felt a surge of resolve. He'd come too far to back down now, and Emma's courage demanded nothing less. Set up a meeting, he told Jack, his voice firm. I want to do this the right way. Understood. I'll make the calls and get back to you with a time and place. Be careful in the meantime, Charles. Trent's people are watching every move. The line clicked, and Charles sat back, feeling the gravity of what lay ahead. He knew he was putting himself, and possibly Lily, in the crosshairs of dangerous people, but the thought of doing nothing weighed on him even more heavily. Emma had trusted him once, trusted his company to do the right thing, and he had failed her. Now, he had a chance to make things right, and he was determined not to let fear sway him. 2 days later, Jack arranged a meeting with a trusted journalist, a veteran investigative reporter named Alice Gray. She had a reputation for tackling hard-hitting stories with an unflinching sense of justice, and her work had exposed several high-profile corruption cases in the past. Charles had never met her, but Jack assured him she was trustworthy and thorough. She would make sure the story was told, no matter how powerful the people involved. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. Charles arrived early, the folder clutched tightly in his hands. He scanned the cafe, taking in each face, feeling a surge of paranoia that one of Trent's men might be lurking in the shadows, watching his every move. But he saw no one suspicious, just the usual mix of patrons enjoying their coffee and reading the morning news. Alice arrived right on time. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back and a pair of sharp, perceptive eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She offered Charles a firm handshake and took a seat across from him, her expression serious yet warm. Mr. Blake, she began, her voice low and professional. Jack told me you have information on the Emerald Heights project. I understand this isn't easy for you, given your position, but I appreciate your courage in coming forward. Charles nodded, his throat dry. He opened the folder, spreading the documents across the table. Miss Gray, I don't need to tell you how serious this is. These documents, Emma Green risked her life to collect them. She tried to stop what was happening, but Trent's people silenced her. Alice's eyes flicked over the documents, her expression growing darker with each page she read. I remember this project, she murmured. It was touted as a model for affordable housing. What a perfect cover for a scheme like this. Exactly, Charles said bitterly. It was all for show. Trent used the project to steal from the city, and Emma paid the price for trying to expose him. Alice looked up, her gaze steady. Do you have any leads on what happened to her? Charles hesitated, then recounted everything he'd learned from Louise and Jack. The warnings, her final trip to the site, and her disappearance shortly afterward. No one's heard from her since. She left behind a daughter, Lily, who's been alone ever since. Alice's face softened at the mention of Lily, and she nodded. We'll need to protect the girl. Once this story breaks, Trent's people may try to retaliate. But I know people who can help keep her safe. She placed a reassuring hand over his. You're doing the right thing, Charles. A swell of relief mixed with apprehension washed over him. He knew the risks, but hearing those words gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you, Alice. I just want to make sure that Emma's story isn't forgotten. Alice carefully gathered the documents into her bag, glancing around to make sure they hadn't drawn any attention. I'll be in touch as soon as I have a draft. This kind of investigation can't be rushed, but I'll work as quickly as possible. We need to be thorough if we're going to take someone like Trent down." Charles nodded, grateful for her commitment. "I'll be ready when you are." As Alice left the cafe, Charles watched her go, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. He was setting something unstoppable into motion, a path that could either bring justice to Emma and Lily or destroy everything he had built. Over the next week, Charles barely slept. Jack kept him updated on Alice's progress, and each new detail she uncovered felt like a victory. She tracked down witnesses, former employees, and contractors who had worked on the Emerald Heights project. Each one had a story, fragments that corroborated Emma's findings. Some were too afraid to speak on record, but enough agreed to testify that a strong case began to emerge. Then, one evening, as Charles was preparing to leave his office, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway, his instincts on high alert. "Mr. Blake," a low, menacing voice said, "I suggest you stop whatever game you're playing. You don't want to make an enemy of the wrong people." Charles felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly. "Let's just say I work for someone who doesn't appreciate meddling in his affairs. You've been warned." The line went dead, leaving Charles holding the phone, his heart pounding. He knew the call had come from one of Trent's men, a direct threat to intimidate him into backing down. But as he placed the phone back on his desk, Charles felt his resolve harden. They could threaten him all they wanted. He was not backing down. That night, he called Jack and Alice, informing them of the threat. Alice's response was firm. "This only proves we're getting close, Charles. They're scared, and they should be. We're not going to let them get away with this." But the threat haunted Charles. He knew he needed to take extra precautions, especially for Lily. That weekend, he arranged for her to stay with a family friend outside the city, someone who could keep her safe and far from the chaos about to unfold. As he watched her leave, a pang of guilt and fear twisted in his chest. But he knew this was the only way to protect her. Lily looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, her small hand slipping into his as they waited for her ride. "You'll be safe there, Lily," he assured her, kneeling down to her level. "Just for a little while, until we sort things out here." Lily nodded, a quiet resilience in her expression. "You'll keep looking for my mom, right?" Charles placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I promise, Lily. We're closer than ever." As she drove off, Charles stood on the curb, watching the car until it disappeared from view. He knew that whatever happened next, he had to see this through, not just for Emma, but for Lily, whose life would finally know peace once the truth was revealed. The story broke early on a Monday morning. Charles woke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. He fumbled for it, his heart leaping with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The news had gone live. Alice had published the exposé on Trent's schemes, a bombshell piece that covered every detail of the Emerald Heights scandal, the embezzlement, the corruption, and the silencing of whistleblowers like Emma Green. He lay in bed, scrolling through the article on his phone. Every word felt like a vindication for Emma and a promise kept to Lily. Alice had been relentless, capturing Emma's courage and determination in vivid detail, weaving in interviews with other former employees who had dared to speak on record. A powerful image of Emma graced the article's header, her face calm and resolute, her eyes focused on a brighter future she had wanted to build. Charles felt a pang of regret that he hadn't supported her sooner, hadn't done more to protect her. But at least now, her voice was being heard. The article spread quickly, the news outlets buzzing with headlines about Trent's possible involvement in fraud and cover-ups. By midday, Charles's phone was flooded with messages and emails from colleagues, lawyers, and journalists, all wanting his response. But he ignored them. Instead, he focused on the calls from Jack and Alice, strategizing their next moves to ensure the story wouldn't be buried by Trent's influence. Alice called later that afternoon. "Charles, it's catching fire. The city is in an uproar, and several officials are already calling for an investigation. But I need you to be careful. Trent's people won't sit by idly." Charles agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in on him. He felt as if he were under a magnifying glass, Trent's eyes watching his every move. He couldn't leave his office without sensing a shadow in his wake, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Trent made a move. By the following day, the ripple effects of the article were in full swing. Charles watched news broadcasts that morning, the headlines flashing across the screen. City officials linked to scandal, business mogul under scrutiny, missing woman's story reopens cold case. Each headline carried the weight of Emma's voice, the voice that had once been silenced. Now, it was thundering through every channel, and the world was listening. But as the day wore on, Charles sensed a change. His office phone rang less often, and the usual flow of emails slowed to a trickle. When he called Jack for an update, his friend's tone was tight. "Charles, I've got intel that Trent's people are scrambling. They're making deals, pulling favors to try and suppress this. They're working fast, and they won't stop until they've silenced everyone who could talk against them." Charles gritted his teeth. "We can't let that happen, Jack. There's too much at stake." Jack sighed. "I'm doing what I can, but this is the kind of situation where things get dangerous. Be careful who you trust." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, Charles made his way to the parking garage, his footsteps echoing in the dimly lit space. The quietness of the garage felt ominous, each shadow a potential threat. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His instincts were on high alert, every sound amplified in his ears. He reached his car and was just unlocking it when a voice echoed from the shadows. "Mr. Blake." He froze, turning to see a man stepping out from behind a concrete pillar. The man was dressed in a dark suit, his expression cold, his stance rigid. Everything about him screamed professionalism, but there was a glint in his eye that made Charles's stomach turn. "Who are you?" Charles asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Let's just say I work for Mr. Trent. He sent me here to deliver a message." Charles's grip on his keys tightened. "I'm not interested in any messages from Trent." The man's smile was thin and humorless. "Mr. Blake, you're a smart man. You understand that every action has consequences. You've stirred up a lot of trouble, and Mr. Trent isn't pleased. He's a reasonable man, but he expects you to back down." Charles's anger flared, but he kept his voice controlled. "Tell Trent I won't be intimidated. The truth is out, and there's nothing he can do to change that." The man took a step closer, his face hardening. "The truth can be managed, Mr. Blake. Controlled. You and I both know that if you back off, this can all disappear quietly. Your life can go back to normal. But if you insist on digging, you're putting yourself, and that little girl, in a dangerous position." A chill washed over Charles. "You leave Lily out of this," he warned, his voice low. The man shrugged. "That's up to you. Just remember, Trent's reach goes far beyond anything you can imagine. People like him don't lose." Charles stared at the man, a surge of fear and anger mingling in his chest. But he kept his expression steady. "I'm not going to stop. Emma's story will be heard, and Lily deserves to know the truth." The man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of steely resolve. "Then you're making a grave mistake." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Charles standing alone, the sound of his retreating footsteps echoing in the empty garage. Charles stood there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew the risks now. Trent was making it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who crossed him. The following days were a whirlwind of tension and fear. Charles knew he couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. He moved between hotels, constantly checking over his shoulder, always wary of who might be following him. He barely slept, his mind consumed by the danger surrounding him and the responsibility he felt to protect Lily. The threats grew more direct, anonymous phone calls, menacing emails, and it was clear that Trent's patience was wearing thin. Meanwhile, Alice continued her work, pushing out follow-up stories, each one chipping away at Trent's carefully constructed empire. The public outcry was growing, and pressure was mounting on city officials to open a formal investigation. The walls around Trent were beginning to close in, but Charles knew they were also closing in on him. One night, exhausted and restless, Charles received a call from Jack. His friend's tone was grim, tinged with urgency. "Charles, you need to get out. Now." Charles sat up, fully alert. What's happened? Trent's people are onto you. They're getting desperate, and there's word that they've been tracking your movements. I don't know how much longer you can keep this up. Charles clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the danger pressing down on him. I can't just disappear, Jack. There's too much at stake. Think about Lily, Jack pressed, his voice softening. You need to stay alive for her. If you go down, Trent wins, and everything Emma fought for will be buried with you. Charles took a shaky breath, realizing the truth in Jack's words. He'd come this far, but he couldn't let his determination turn into recklessness. If he wasn't careful, he'd end up leaving Lily as alone as Emma had been. I'll go underground, Charles said finally. I'll lay low, but I'm not giving up. Trent can try to silence me, but this story is out there now. Alice won't stop, and neither will I. Jack sighed, a note of relief in his voice. Good. Keep me updated, and for God's sake, be careful. As Charles hung up, he realized he had one last thing to do. He needed to see Lily, to make sure she was safe, to reassure her that everything he was doing was for her and her mother. He arranged to meet her at a quiet, secluded park near the outskirts of the city. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't leave without seeing her one last time. The day of their meeting was cold and overcast, the sky heavy with thick gray clouds. Charles arrived early, pacing near a grove of trees, his nerves frayed and his heart heavy. Finally, he saw Lily approaching, her small figure bundled in a coat, her eyes wide with curiosity and worry. Mr. Blake, she said, her voice soft as she walked up to him. Charles knelt down, meeting her gaze. Lily, I wanted to see you. There are some things you should know. Her expression grew serious, and she looked up at him with that unshakable trust that pierced his heart. Did you find out what happened to my mom? He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Yes, Lily. Your mother was a very brave woman. She tried to make things better, to help people who needed it, even when it was dangerous for her. She fought for what was right, and she never stopped, even when others tried to silence her. A glimmer of understanding passed over her face, and she nodded slowly. So, she was a hero? Charles felt a swell of pride mixed with sorrow. Yes, Lily, she was a hero, and she loved you very much. Lily looked down, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Thank you, Mr. Blake, for helping me find her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I promised you, didn't I? They shared a long, quiet moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. As they parted, Charles felt a sense of finality, but also of hope. He knew he would carry on, no matter what it took, and with Lily's trust behind him, he felt a renewed determination. As he walked away, he looked back one last time, watching her disappear into the distance, and he knew that, no matter the cost, he would make sure Emma's legacy and Lily's future were safe from the darkness that had threatened them for so long. In the days that followed his final meeting with Lily, Charles kept himself hidden, shifting from one safe location to the next, always on the move. Each time he heard footsteps in a hallway or the distant hum of a car engine, his pulse raced, his instincts sharp and ready. He knew that Malcolm Trent's men were still out there, hunting him, determined to stop him from pushing any further. But Charles was no longer alone. Since the article had gone public, Alice and Jack had stayed close, watching out for him and coordinating efforts to protect Lily and anyone else who had come forward in Emma's story. Alice's articles had made waves far beyond the city limits, and the national media had picked up on the story, exposing Trent's crimes on a national stage. Soon, the calls for justice had grown too loud to ignore. Political leaders, local journalists, and even former allies of Trent had begun distancing themselves, either out of fear or a sudden surge of moral duty. Then, one afternoon, as Charles was sitting by a small motel window, his phone buzzed with a call from Jack. He braced himself, wondering if this would be news of yet another threat or warning. Charles, it's over, Jack said, his voice tinged with relief and excitement. Malcolm Trent was taken into custody an hour ago. Federal agents raided his estate, his offices, everything. He's done. The words sank in slowly, their impact hitting Charles like a wave. They got him? They got him, Jack confirmed, laughing breathlessly. Alice's article and all the new witnesses gave the authorities everything they needed to bring him down. Trent tried to run, but they caught him at his private jet. There's no way he's getting out of this. Charles slumped back in his seat, letting out a deep, shaky breath. After all the fear, the threats, the long nights of watching his back, the nightmare was finally ending. He could hardly believe it. "And Lily?" he asked quietly. "She's safe?" Jack's voice softened. "Yes, she's safe. We've made sure she's well protected, and we're arranging for her to be taken into a better care situation. It's going to take time, but people are stepping up to help." Charles felt tears prick his eyes, a sense of relief and gratitude swelling inside him. "Thank you, Jack, for everything." "No," Jack replied. "Thank you, Charles. You risked everything to make sure Emma's story was told. She deserved that. And so did her daughter." When the call ended, Charles sat alone in silence, staring out the window at the quiet street below. For the first time in months, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth was out, and Trent's hold over the city had finally been broken. Emma's fight hadn't been in vain. Her bravery had torn down walls of corruption, and her voice had finally been heard. Several weeks later, Charles received an invitation to attend a small ceremony being held at a community center in one of the city's newly restored neighborhoods. It was a gathering organized by former residents of Emerald Heights and their families, a celebration of the people who had fought to save their community. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he should go. His connection to the project was complicated, and he feared that his involvement might bring back painful memories. But something urged him to go. Perhaps it was the desire to honor Emma's memory one final time, to stand among the people she had cared for and dedicated herself to. When he arrived at the community center, he was greeted warmly, yet cautiously, by people who recognized him from the news. Some eyed him with gratitude. Others looked at him with reservation. Charles accepted it all, knowing he still had a long path toward redemption. He found a seat near the back of the room, blending into the crowd as best he could, his gaze scanning the gathering. And then he saw her, Lily. She was standing with a kind-faced woman who held her hand gently, guiding her through the crowd as they greeted familiar faces. Lily looked healthier, her cheeks fuller, her clothes clean and new. But what struck Charles most was the expression on her face. She looked at peace. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. She was no longer a lost girl on the streets, but a child with a future, a chance to live the life her mother had fought so hard to secure. As their eyes met across the room, Lily's face broke into a soft smile. She let go of the woman's hand and walked over to Charles, her steps hesitant but filled with purpose. When she reached him, she looked up, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Mr. Blake," she said finally, her voice steady, "I wanted to thank you for finding the truth about my mom." Charles knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. He took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. "Lily, your mom. She was one of the bravest people I've ever known. She wanted to make the world a better place. And you're just like her." Lily's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and sadness. "I miss her, but now I know. She didn't leave because she didn't love me. She had to help people." Charles reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's right. And she loved you more than anything. She never stopped thinking about you." They sat in silence for a moment, the bustling sounds of the gathering fading into the background. Finally, Charles spoke again, his voice soft. "What are you going to do now, Lily?" She looked away, thinking for a moment. "I want to help people, too, like my mom did." Her words were simple, but Charles could see the resolve in her eyes. She was determined to carry forward her mother's legacy, to become the kind of person who would stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. He nodded, a sense of pride and hope swelling in his chest. "I think that's a wonderful idea, and I'll be here to help you however I can." Lily smiled, and this time, it was a true, unguarded smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blake." They stood together, side by side, watching the gathering of people who had come to honor Emma's memory. Charles knew that his journey was far from over. There would be years of rebuilding ahead, both for himself and for the community he had once turned a blind eye to. But now, He was ready to face it, to take responsibility for the role he'd played, and to dedicate his life to making things right. In the weeks that followed, Charles worked closely with Jack and Alice, helping to ensure that the remaining survivors of Trent's corruption received the restitution they deserved. With Trent's assets frozen and his empire dismantled, the city was able to rebuild Emerald Heights as it had once been intended, a place where families could find safety, community, and hope. The new development was renamed the Emma Green Community Center, in honor of the woman who had refused to give up on her dream of a better world. As for Charles, he found new purpose in working alongside those he had once neglected. He sold off portions of his business, dedicating the profits to local initiatives and programs that provided housing, education, and employment opportunities to underprivileged families. And through it all, he stayed close to Lily, becoming a mentor, a guardian, and a friend. Together, they visited the community center regularly, sharing stories about Emma and ensuring that her legacy lived on. In time, the city healed, the scars of the past fading as new lives took root in the places that had once been marred by corruption and greed. And in that renewed city, Charles found a sense of peace he had never known before, a quiet understanding that redemption was not a single act but a lifelong journey, one he would gladly walk every day. And so, the lives of those touched by Emma Green's courage, her daughter, her friends, and even those who had once failed her, continued forward, bound by a legacy of resilience and the shared promise to build a better future, one step at a time.